Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of the New Arab Book Club. I'm Elias Jahshan, and today we are joined by British Arab writer Amy Abdelnoor to discuss her debut novel, Everland. Set in Palestine at the beginning of the Second Intifada, the novel follows two young women, Dinah, a Jewish teenager newly arrived from London, and Safa, a Palestinian whose family history is intimately tied to the land. Moving between past and present as their lives unfold on opposite sides of the Israeli occupation, it explores grief, identity, displacement, and the complicated relationship between people, memory, and land. The novel draws partly on Amy's own experience of working in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and in the occupied West Bank. Published by Hutchinson Heinemann, an early version of Everland was shortlisted for the 2023 Lucy Cavendish Fiction Prize.
Thanks so much for having me.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Everland grew partly from your own experience of working in refugee camps, Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and occupied West Bank. Are you able to take us through when those experiences first began to take shape in the form of a novel, or was it around this time that the novel idea came to you?
Yeah, so it was over 20 years ago that I was living in Rashidia and then in Nahl Bared and Badawi in the north. And then after several years of working in the refugee camps, I then lived in Ramallah and worked with local NGOs in Ramallah and lived there in the Second Intifada. I was writing home the whole time when I was there. I was writing emails to anybody whose address I had. I was also crafting various kind of reflective, creative pieces based on what I was seeing and experiencing. So in many ways, the genesis of the novel sits with the Amy of 20, 25 years ago. And of course, with the stories of people that I was living and working with and my own experiences when I was then under occupation. So I would say that the genesis of the novel is there, but I didn't really commit to writing fully until almost 2 decades later in 2019. And that was a story of personal growth and my own development and my own finally taking up this challenge to write a novel that so many people for years have been saying to me, you really should write a book, and me basically going through a period of self-doubt. But the come from those times, and some of the most profound stories were obviously of people that I met and lived with. And writing a novel is a little bit like, I've likened it to a lost jigsaw puzzle, where you keep collecting these pieces and, wondering how they're going to fit together. And your subconscious mind does a huge amount of work, often when you're asleep and often in the quiet times in between or when you're doing something else. And suddenly you'll think, oh, I've got something that's going to hang it together. So maybe I can take you through a few of the ideas that sort of eventually fell into the jigsaw puzzle that sort of made the story. So one of the first women I met in Rashidia, who I lived with, 10 years older than me, a dear friend of mine, who I've asked her permission to share her story. The very first night we met, she told me her background. So she was from a family that had been forcibly evicted in 1948. She was born in a refugee camp. In the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, she was fleeing with her parents and younger siblings in their car. And the Israelis shot and killed her parents in front of her, aged 14. And she was left to raise her 5 younger siblings. Her one brother lost the sight in his eye. 2 brothers were eventually taken to a village in Switzerland, an SOS village. And the other 2 siblings suffered severe schizophrenia the rest of their lives. They still live with schizophrenia today. So I lived in her house with 2 of her siblings who had schizophrenia. And, this is a woman who was 10 years older than me, in her late 20s, who had been looking after her family since she was 14. And, one part of me spent a lot of those times just thinking about how little separates me from her, an accident of birth. And my grandfather was Lebanese, how easily my life could have been different. So when I then went to live in Ramallah, Siam said to me, would you mind going and finding my village? And her village was from northern historic Palestine. And as you and I know all too well, Israel has built car parks over some villages, built so-called national parks over some villages. But her village in the north hadn't been built over. So when I got there, I was able to identify it as as her village because of the cactus plants that were growing there amidst the stones of the houses. Some stones, you know how some of them just kind of remain. And of course, the cactus plant used to be used by Palestinians as the natural fencing for their homes. And the cactus plant has tenacious roots. And we know that sabar, meaning cactus plant, and in Palestinian dialect, in Aramiya, they're virtually synonymous, patience and cactus. And that's why it's become symbolic. But I stood there and really felt the presence of the past. I stood there and I remember being absolutely overwhelmed by the idea that Israel can destroy houses and it can destroy people, but it cannot destroy the land and what the land holds, and that the land will speak. So it was a profoundly moving experience. And also I felt like I was, doing something for my friend, but also the pain of her not being able to go there herself. That sat inside me for a long time, alongside a response to some of the emails that I was writing home when I was living in Ramallah. So I was writing in Ramallah about some of the things that I'd witnessed when I went out to report for the NGO I was working with, and some of the things I'd experienced myself. So I would just talk about, there used to be one checkpoint between East Jerusalem and Ramallah, and now there are 3, and then there are, that kind of thing. One response to an email has stayed with me. And it was somebody who was born and raised in North London who replied to me and said, Amy, there are 2 sides to every story and you're getting very caught up in one of them. And I am still angry about that email. I burn with qahr, the Arabic we know for the slow fermenting kind of rage, because I felt I was being silenced. This was what somebody that she knew was saying, I had seen with my own eyes, was describing the reality on the ground, but it was absolute understanding of what decades of racism and dehumanization does, and of how easily and flippantly people in the so-called West, in the Northern Hemisphere, with their so-called, their narrative of superiority can silence somebody else's truth. I wrote back and I said, if I could bring you here for a week or a day or an hour, you'd get it. And so I think in lots of ways, the genesis of the story comes from those 2 sets of experiences, this desire to respond and a desire to bring somebody who is not able to go to that place. And of course, then the Palestinian story. And very much inspired by the cactus plant and that experience on the land. And I remember I was going for a walk near my house when 2019, I was a sort of shift in my life, and I thought, I'm going to really try and do this writing. And I remember going for the walk and thinking, the cactus plant is the conduit. The cactus plant is the link between the past and the present, and everything is, kind of facilitated and enabled because of the sabr plant. So, yeah.
Well, that was going to be my next question about the cactus plant.
Sorry,
so thank you.
Sorry. It's kind of hard to talk about the beginning of the novel without talking about that.
I did notice the cactus plant plays like a constant reoccurrence in themes. I obviously know what it means, but I wanted to ask about where that came from. So, yeah.
And of course, the irony now, or the fact that Israelis who are born inside Israel after 1948 call themselves Sabra Israelis. So the appropriation of the language in every way, how loaded language becomes when it's appropriated by the colonizer as well, was something I was really, I think at one point Dinah's mum makes reference to it. So there's all those nuances into what that plant means and should mean, and how it's also been appropriated. Yeah.
I think as a Palestinian myself, it's also refreshing to see the cactus plant take center stage, because quite often the olive tree gets the attention, and sometimes the orange groves as well. Yeah. But the cactus plant is, I'm not saying it doesn't get enough love. I mean, amongst Palestinians, we all love the cactus plant for that reason. But in the wider world, wider literature, it doesn't get that much, So.
Also, I think there's a real beauty to the idea that this is how they fence their land. Yeah. And the idea that speaks to me as well of Palestinian and indigenous communities' connection to the land and understanding of it, and the idea that everything about the way Palestinians lived will want to live and would like to live in the future on their land is about harmony with nature. It's never about anything destructive, and the strength of emotion of Palestinians to exactly where they're from precisely, and what different, plants and fruit plants, trees, whatever, how they grow in a particular area is so important. So it kind of speaks to that, and that idea that that's not going to go away.
Yeah, I agree. And so how long did it take for you to write Everland? I know you mentioned you started writing it in 2019. Like, how long did it, are you able to talk us through
Yes, absolutely. So 2019, I'd been writing bits and pieces for a few years and been sort of procrastinating and not really believing in myself. So 2019, I was just writing every day about anything, and started to have this idea, and then went back to old emails and diaries and reread, fiction and non-fiction that I'd read years ago to sort of re-immerse myself. And it was sort of 2020 when I was finishing up something else that I was doing that I kind of got the sense of the structure of the novel. And I actually sort of found out how it was going to start. And then I thought, right, I'm going to get working on this. And I was writing, and I'd got to about 25,000, 30,000 words. And I knew what was going to happen in the plot, but I kept getting stuck on how I was writing. I mean, writing is hard work, right? And, you can get very easily distracted by your day job, which in my case is teaching 3 days a week and having 3 children. So, full-time mum, part-time teacher, and trying to write. And in 2022, so between 2020 and January 2022, I was just trying to work on it myself and stopping and starting, and then getting distracted into more research, which is also really important because that's what enables the ideas to crystallize. And spending ages like working out my characters' names, and therefore doing a lot of character work, and exactly where the book was set, and exactly what year, and exactly what the background to my British Jewish character was going to be, the sort of everything below the iceberg that you don't see. 2022, I did a writing course, partly to make myself write and finish the book. So I got all the way to the end of the book, apart from the last scene. And in July 2022, I was trying to write the last scene. I knew exactly how it was going to end. 2 weeks of writing every morning in a cafe. I could not get the end of the book out. So I put it in a drawer, came back to it 4 months later, read it and thought, the plot is absolutely fine, but I'm telling the story the wrong way. I dumped 98,000 words and started again. Yeah. So I thought, right, no, I've got to go back to how I was originally thinking of telling it in this split narrative. Started work on it again, and then entered it for the Lucy Cavendish Prize. I think you only had to have like a part manuscript. Got shortlisted, and they said, right, you need the full manuscript by the ceremony day, which was 6 weeks later. So I just bashed it out. Wow. But of course, I'd done all the work. All the work in that first draft, all that thinking time actually meant I was like, okay, I've got to do this now. Nothing motivates me like a deadline.
I'm a journalist. I get it.
Yeah, exactly. But it was really cathartic because I was suddenly like, I can do this. And I got the whole thing out. So that was April 2023 or May 2023, full draft. And then I worked on it, edited it a bit after the prize ceremony, etc., and signed with my agent in June 23. So by June 23, I had a really polished draft, but we still worked on it. So then I did some edits with my agent, and then we submitted in 2024. And then the process between 24 and now has been all the structural edits you do with your editor, and then the line edits and the copy edits and the proofreading and so on.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah.
So your novel begins with 2 young women entering the same historical moment from profoundly different positions. One during the 1967 Nakba, and the other on the eve of the Second Intifada. Is there a particular reason why you constructed the story from these contrasting perspectives? Yes,
time perspectives as well. Yeah, absolutely. So I needed the story to be set predominantly at the present moment of the story to be the 2000s. For a couple of reasons. First of all, because that was when I'd been there, and when I'd lived there, and when I knew Ramallah and the checkpoints, and I wanted to write. People have asked me, about how much of writing is your own experience, and I think you filter everything, and you do write experiences that aren't yours, but the familiarity of some things helps you get into the things that you don't know. But I wanted things like Qalandia to be how I'd remembered it. Qalandia now, as you know, is like an airport, except for with violence. But of course, they'd started building the wall by the mid-2000s. And as soon as you've got the wall in the way, loads of things that happen in my book can't happen. So I very quickly decided it has to be then. Also for other reasons, like just the idea of technology not being as developed as it was, because I wanted more of the question marks over, nowadays you've got Find My and all the rest of it. Also things like, interesting, I was thinking about this morning, things like food and the idea of hummus and za'atar and sumat not being as ubiquitous in the West as it is now, so that there was kind of unfamiliarity for Dinah and her family. So lots of reasons from that point of view. And then Safa's 1967 rather than 48 was partly a practical thing in terms of she couldn't have been dead for too long before Dinah turned up. That's not a spoiler, obviously. We find that out quite quickly. But also, of course, 67 is when Israel took control of the West Bank and Gaza. So actually, 48 to 67, Jordan controlled the West Bank and Egypt controlled Gaza. And actually, the movement between 1948 Palestine and the West Bank was different again. So actually, I needed it to be a time that would work from that point of view as well. And then I spent a long time thinking geographically, and I won't give any more details because it's a spoiler, but of exactly the location, although I don't name them. A discerning reader who knows Palestine could work out exactly where I'm talking about.
I figured it out pretty quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. But somebody who doesn't know Palestine won't know that. But someone who's Palestinian goes, oh, I know where this is. But I wanted that to be the case because it was important to me that there was that geographical reality to it.
Cool,
yeah,
cool. And how did you approach writing a character such as Dinah, whose assumptions about Palestine may initially differ from your own?
Absolutely. And I think that was really important to me because I have been, as mentioned to you before we came on air, really delighted that Palestinians who've read the book have responded really positively to it. But, in lots of ways, I wrote this book for an audience who don't know. And I think, there's a comfort for people who do understand in reading things that speak to what they feel, and that can be hugely cathartic and also empowering. But I want people who don't understand Palestine to read this book. So in a way, I was coming from those perceptions. And of course, those perceptions aren't mine, but they're the perceptions that I've met constantly over the last couple of decades since I came back, whenever I've talked about Palestine, whether it's been with people who are just ignorant through lack of interaction or whether people who are willfully ignorant. We are up against decades of misinformation and denigration. So I think in a way I was writing what I had experienced from the other side. And then, it was a deliberate choice to make my character English from North London. At one point one of the genesis of the novel was that she was American Jewish, and I was going to have a split narrative where her house had been demolished in America by mistake, and she was kind of being visited by a Palestinian whose house had been demolished on purpose. And then I needed her to come. I wanted to bring her geographically. And it's also helpful, I think, for the novel because readers who don't know Palestine come from somewhere they know. So there's a degree of comfort when they meet Dinah because she's familiar. So she comes from, she's the girl next door or she's the neighbour or whatever. And so they can feel that familiarity before I then bring them to a space that they don't understand or know.
Okay, cool. And when I was about Safa, she's got much more of an immediate and inherited relationship with the land. How did you develop her voice without reducing her to a symbol of Palestinian suffering?
Well, I'm so glad you say that because obviously that was my aim. Safa, in lots of ways, I think, came to me fully formed. When I'd decided on this split narrative and I'd read Murad Barghouti's book again, I Saw Ramallah, and I was thinking about the whole idea of first and second, and the epigraph to the book is Start Your Story with Secondly.
Book, by the way, everyone should read that.
Absolutely, everyone should read it. And I just had this vision in my head of this girl arriving to this brand new White House, feeling really discombobulated and being watched by this spirit soul who was burning with qahar, with the rage. And that was Safa, and I kind of knew her. I felt like I knew her. Took a while to work out her name. But then I think in lots of ways, Safa is the embodiment of everything I absorbed in a way, living in Ramallah and living in the refugee camps. I was 19 when I went to Rashidiyah, pretty much, I mean, with a really small group of people, 4 of us. And that's an intense experience to be, living in houses with Palestinian families. I mean, it's one of the best. I mean, I have so much love and joy thinking about those times, the same as I have love and joy of living in Ramallah under occupation because of the people I was with. But that's profoundly affecting. And I feel things very viscerally. I'm a hugely emotional person. So I think I absorbed a lot of that. And of course, as well, the stories of people, people who shared their lives with me. So I think Safa, I'm glad she comes across as fully formed and not just a symbol of suffering. And I was worried about that because I needed to write Palestinian suffering because I needed to write what occupation is. And occupation is daily structural violence. And occupation is every single part of your life, as you and I know too well, is affected by it. And that's what it's so hard to explain to people who don't understand occupation. And also you have a framework of war in their heads. Because of the terminology of the media, people think of a war and they think of 2 sides and they think there's a frontier in a really kind of World War I way. The most they can get is to World War II sometimes, because that's where we're taught about it. So when you're trying to explain to people, no, this is a layering. And when we're talking about structural violence and when we're talking about occupational repression being everything from what water you can access to electricity to the permit system. You and I know every single area of life is infiltrated. So I had to write that because that is unfortunately definitive of Palestinian life in occupied Palestine. But Safa is also, she recognizes things in Dinah that she wasn't able to have herself, and she can see the joy that could have been possible in those. And then there are moments, of course, like her affection for her sister is so strong, and her affection for her family, and her affection for the things that she wanted in her life. So I did try and make sure I had a sense of what I feel defines the beauty of Palestinian character, like the generosity, the sharing of food. These are absolutely intrinsic to what it is to be Palestinian and Lebanese. That whole area, Balad al-Sham, the idea that someone can come into your house and stay for 3 days and you don't ask any questions. It's beautiful. That's everything I love about the culture. And I hope that's why food plays a big part in it. It's why language plays a big part in it as well, because, there's lots of Arabic in the book. Because that's another beautiful thing. The idea of the dance of Arabic language, the way the choreographing of call and response, أهلا وسهلا أهلا فيكي نورت البيت نورك, all these things. It's just beautiful, and we don't have it in English.
No.
So I hope that the roundness and fullness of Safa's life comes across in the things that I find really important, and they're also the things that are, I think, really denigrated by the West.
And I'm interested in how you chose a Jewish character from Britain who moved to an spoiler, Israeli settlement as one of your 2 main characters alongside a Palestinian native to the land. I think you touched on this a bit earlier, but it was an underlying message by having these 2 main characters share the spotlight in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that...
give me more context of why I'm asking that, because I know there might be some hardcore readers who might say, Jewish characters we've already got stories told from Jewish perspectives about Palestine. Why are you including making her share with the Palestinians?
No, I hear that, and and it is something that's gone through my head, because the readers who I want to accept that I'm writing this story are Palestinians, right? I think it's because of the story that I'm telling, and this is not about a both sidesism, and this is not about saying there are 2 sides to the story. On the contrary, this is about saying the 2 sides that you think there are because you're told that are actually very different. So come with me and see it, which is why I needed this character to come. I also think that you can't understand Palestine without understanding occupation. And unfortunately, Palestinians for the last 100 years have been defined by what is being done to them. And, if the world had been different, 200 years ago, if we hadn't had the Balfour Declaration, if we hadn't decades of racism, etc. But that is Palestinian identity now. Palestinian identity is what they don't have. It's what that's being taken away from them. And it's also obviously what they're striving to hold on to, and the tenacity and steadfastness that they've become, synonymous with, which is also, why should one people have to be so steadfast? But I think the fact of the matter is, when you're Palestinian, you're talking about, well, I asked you, well, where in Palestine is your family from? And so I'm working out, are you 48? Are you 67? Are you diaspora? Are you refugee Palestinian? Are you a Palestinian who then got residency in Lebanon? So, all these things are so nuanced and detailed. And so I think, and that's because occupation has defined them. So I think in a way, I'm writing about the occupied and the Palestinian, and I kind of de facto have to, the way I'm telling the story, write about the occupier. But also, of course, she is Jewish because that's what allows her to live in Israel. But in a way, she's also the person who might go and ask a question. The kinds of people that we've seen over the last few years, lots of whom have been Jewish, but also have been other, often young people who've recognised that the story that they've been told in history books and in school has been incorrect. And actually the awakening that we've seen in young people over the last 3 years, for me, has been quite reassuring, because I've thought, and also frustrating that my book wasn't out before, because I've thought, that's the point. That's the point. It's a political awakening. So if anyone's listening to this and hasn't read it, I'd just say read it and then make a decision, because it's my story for Palestine and Palestinians. And I hope that shines through beyond anything, ultimately.
Thank you. And one of the prominent themes of your novel, we talked about the cactus already, but just the premise of the land. It carries memory, it carries inheritance, it carries a political meaning as well, especially for Palestinians. So what does the title Everland mean for you?
Yes, well, initially the title was the Sabr plant.
Okay.
That's what it went out on submission as. And my editor, who was, before she left for Faber, half Palestinian, half Italian, which was amazing to have a Palestinian editor, said, right, we're going to change the title. I said, oh, I like the title. It's really important. And she said, yes, too esoteric. People won't be able to pronounce it. People won't know what it means. Says, okay. So we had a very long conversation and email before she revealed the title. She said, emailed me and said, I need to talk to you. Right. Gave me all of her rationale for it. And then when she said it, I said, I love it. Don't worry. It's good. I love it because I think it encapsulates what the Sabr plant is, but in a more reader-friendly way. Because, of course, the point of the cactus plant for me is the everness of it, is the fact that it will endure. But I also think what's really great about Everland is it is the everness of it, the continuity of it is the Palestinian spirit. It's the fact that, the spirit is not going to go away. These are the indigenous people who belong to the land. It's also kind of the idea of what Palestine means, I feel, in a kind of international psyche. Why is this land? Why is it the land that is so? Because it's the the birth point of the three Abrahamic religions, and not to go into a digression on, the notion of religion being completely exploited in this political, situation. But it does have that resonance for those three religions. And it is therefore the Everland for this religious, spirituality. And it's also, of course, geographically and politically, the point at which West Asia and the Northern Hemisphere, meet. So it's kind of got that kind of really cartographical quality to it as well. So I think and also time, ever. And for me, time was really important in the book. Safa's written in the present tense and Dinah's written in the past tense. And that was so important to me, to have this idea of the past always being in the present, and the fact that you can't understand Palestine without understanding the past. And also the idea that for Palestinians, their past is ever present in their daily life. When you meet a Palestinian child in a refugee camp in Lebanon, they come up to you and the first thing they say is, Ana Palestiniya. And, I've never heard an English child run up to me and say, I'm English. It's not the first thing they say. And then they tell you what village they're from. They tell you exactly where on the map it is. And then they tell you where their house in their village is. And then they tell you what grows on the land in their house. And they know it. And then they tell you the layout of the house in minute detail, because memory is a necessity. So I think it speaks to all those things.
And memory is inherited as well. So
and trauma as well.
Yeah. In the process of writing the book, did you come to a new understanding of yourself as a British Arab or a British Lebanese person?
I haven't had that question before. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think that when I first lived in Lebanon, I felt like a part of me was coming home. And obviously part of the experience defined my Englishness, because you go away from home and you think about what you like about where you've been brought up. But there were parts of me that really fell into place, things that felt very at home with, the dynamics of the family spaces there, not just the food, but the whole cultural feeling. And also just, not all Arabs are loud, but I'm a very loud person. Most people in my life have told me, be quiet. I'm just talking at normal volume. What do you want about? Or, the kind of energy of interactions and the passion of interactions that's very un-British about me and my whole family. And, people who have married into our family, it's, that tends to be an overriding feature of us. So that, I think, lots of those things felt really coming home there and then in Ramallah. And I think, I then built my adult life in the UK largely because I was completely disenfranchised with international development by the time I left, and and the UN, and I did a placement at the UN. I thought, I can't work for them. I got headhunted by the Foreign Office. I thought, there's no way I'm working for the Foreign Office. So I part of it was I'm going to teach so that I can help to actually educate people, and also all the students I've ever taught have learned about Palestine. So the process of writing the book took me back to things that I had moved more away from because of life and children and so on. And I think they really have reasserted for me absolutely what my heritage is inside me. And especially editing over the last 3 years, where I felt silence for decades over Palestine, because although I could speak more freely in the classroom 20 years ago, a lot more freely, and I did assemblies about Palestine and refugees in quite a few schools, which would be really hard to do now. But I've still felt silenced by people's response to me that I've talked about earlier. But of course, all of that has been heightened massively in the last 3 years. So I think over the last 3 years of being intensely absorbed in editing my book, a time where we're witnessing the worst things we've ever imagined witnessing. And I've been lying in bed, like we all have, thinking about what we've seen, feeling like I'm method acting my book in some way, like living my life and being visited by these images. But all of that has crystallized for me even more where my morality is and where I feel most accepted in a way. Because if I'm going to be around people who can't accept that part of me, then I'm not interested in being around those people. So I think it's really heightened for me what my heritage means, and I think it's not peculiar for third generation. I think lots of third generation, immigrants turn to their heritage. I think it's quite something that does happen quite a lot. But it's also not universal. But I also think that we just talked about inherited trauma and inheriting the past and inheriting memory. And I do feel that, for me, clearly I genetically or emotionally have inherited a huge amount of what my grandfather's Lebanese past means and meant to him. And that's just become stronger and stronger. And the desire to be around people who understand that and feel that has become stronger and stronger.
Thank you for sharing that. And you're talking a little bit about how going through the process of in a time of genocide, do you think your book, or your relationship with your book at least, would be different if in an alternative world the Gaza genocide never happened?
Yeah, for me it's really strange. And again, I sort of say this, the fact that I can say it's strange for me feels wrong, because it doesn't feel right to be thinking about something that's me-centered when people have been dying for their freedom and fighting for their lives. But I signed with my agent And I thought, right, this is it. I've got shortlisted for this prize, pretty prestigious, got a really good endorsement from Rose Tremaine. Like, wow, my book's going to happen. I felt like this is it. I'm on my journey to publication now. I went back to Israel, Palestine in August 2023 because I needed to research the bits of the book that were set in Tel Aviv. I needed to just double check things. So I say Israel, Palestine because I did actually have to go into Tel Aviv. And I came back from my first meeting with my agent and said to my husband, I need to go back and I'm going to go next week because it's the last week of the holidays. And if I don't go then, I won't be able to go till October. And so then to come back and have everything happen just felt super surreal. And then, of course, I went through that whole process of thinking, well, what's going to happen to the book? Because obviously we know where public opinion and media narrative lay in October, November, December, and hasn't changed as much as we want, but there has been a shift. And again, the fact that I was worried about my book felt wrong. Why should I worry about my book? If the book doesn't happen, the book doesn't happen. That's not important. But of course, I'd also worked on it. So for me, professionally and creatively, I was working really hard on redefining myself as a writer. I know that my teaching is important, but I wanted to have something that wasn't just teaching in my life. So I'd worked, officially from 2019 in my kind of terms, but I've been working for about 6-7 years before that on trying when I could to write. So yeah, the book then shifted from me thinking that it was going to be just niche literary fiction that might be read by some people who were interested to suddenly thinking as the genocide went on and as the public opinion did change and as there were clearly no red lines and everything got worse and worse, realizing actually there are many more platforms for lots of people, for journalists, for musicians, for filmmakers. We've seen lots of people artistically and creatively find new audiences. And of course, that's been really important because that's how we get stories about Palestine out. But that goes hand in hand with an awful dissonance. And I just think anybody who's involved in anything in their work, creatively or journalistically, who is finding new audiences and readerships because of the genocide. And this includes charities actually that have now grown because they've got more followers and more income, is just in this space of thinking, how am I supposed to reconcile these two things? That this growth has happened because of this loss. And that's just horrific. And I there is no reconciling. It's a constant state of dissonance. So I feel now, and I spoke about this at my launch, it's been really exciting seeing it come into the world. It's like having a fourth child. It's a part of me, it feels like it's a part of me that is now out there. And to be able to talk about it with people and to have real readers respond to it and say they like it and is amazing. It's a complete creative fulfillment, but it runs absolutely parallel with a narrative in my head of Lebanon, Palestine, the West Bank, Gaza, Iran, the whole time. And I think there are lots of us who must be living like that.
What assumptions about Palestine would you most like readers to question after reading your novel?
Very interesting question. Do you know, early on in the genocide, I was in my classroom at school feeling very silenced and feeling very isolated. And somebody came in and I just burst into tears and I just said, I just want people to understand that Palestinians are human and see them as kin. Because I felt so overwhelmed by the look on people's faces if I talked about Palestinians, as though they were not worthy of
Somewhere far away.
Yeah. Basically, racism. And for me, I said to you at the beginning, when I lived in the camps, yes, it was my heritage saying I could have been born here. But I also just think it's a philosophical question, isn't it? What makes you you? What makes the voice inside your head, the spirit soul, the energy that is you? What makes you you? What separates one life from another? And, we are an energy, and I believe in the afterlife in a spiritual way. I'm not hugely religious, but I definitely believe in the idea of your energy going somewhere. So the idea that we are only a whisper from a different life, to me, is really strong. So for me, I think regardless of heritage, these people, it's kin, it's kinship. It's seeing somebody who is not you with the same empathy as you see somebody who is you or like you. And I really hope ultimately that because it's a story and it's emotional, that people respond with empathy, and it causes them to pause in some of the prejudices that they might have, and question some of the. So you asked me what would I most like them to question? I think, I'd like them to go away and think, I'm going to find out more about how occupation works, or what checkpoints mean, or what exactly is going on. What is this? What does this land look like? But ultimately, if you can see somebody else as kin, then it should just follow that nobody should have to endure daily violence in order to live a life. Like, it should be a natural progression then. If you can honestly see someone else as kin, there should be no question about why we should be trying to challenge a world that seems to insist on the primacy of a military-industrial complex.
100%. So what's next for you? I know you've just published a book, but what's next for you?
Well, obviously, I would love this book to keep on finding readers, and this is why all of these events are so important. I've got a lovely couple of months of interviews, events, all around the country, festivals, which I'm squeezing into my life alongside teaching and children. But that's great because I really like speaking about it. I think it's a book that deserves to be talked about. And for me, again, professionally, that's a really lovely development that I've been wanting to move into for years. And also, obviously, carry on writing. So I have got a book in the making, 30,000 words into another novel, which I had to pause when I was sort of working on promoting this one. So I think come September, I need to get back into really early mornings, because when I write, I get up at 5 a.m. and write before school in the quiet time. And that requires a lot of energy. So, but I feel I'm exhausted, but I'm also energized by the idea of, okay, the fact that it's landing, the fact that I'm getting this reader response is just makes me really feel like, I can do this and I want to do it again.
Will they be released on the other side of the Atlantic?
Oh, I have a US deal.
Amazing.
I got a US deal a couple of months ago with the only Palestinian publishing house in America. Interlink.
Oh, wow. Amazing.
So that was amazing. And actually one of them was at my launch. They were in the UK. And I had a lovely Zoom call with them. And I just felt like I was coming home. I got off the call and I cried, and I just felt like everything that I might worry about publishing a book will be understood. Yeah. So it was a beautiful thing. And of course, to be published by a Palestinian publishing house. What more can I ask?
Amazing. Yeah. Any famous last words? Anything else you want to add before we wrap up?
No, I think, I feel like it's a story now. I hope that readers will fall in love with what I've written because of and the characters, and will then take it where they need to take it. And I hope it energizes and empowers people who are already part of this beautiful movement for freedom for Palestine, and will cause hearts and minds to change for those who aren't yet on board.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
Amy Abdelnoor, everybody, and this is her book, Everland. Please do buy it and support Palestinian voices in literature. Thank you. See you in the next episode.
Thank you.